Hello, everyone. Welcome to another part of Let's Talk About. The last time I made an episode of Let's Talk About, I was talking about my fondest Spider Man memories. So today, I want to talk about something that's very near and dear to my spider heart, which is Spider Man artists and writers. And I just wanted to do a top five list of Spider Man artists that are my favorite ones. And this isn't a definitive all time best kind of list. It's just a list of my own personal favorites. So I just want to list the creators that I'm familiar with on their run that had lengthy runs on the comics. Like, for example, it's an artist that stayed at least 1 year or at the very least like 10 issues on the series, not like some kind of one off or a spin off or a one shot or anything of the sort. Just pretty much, yes, the good run, solid run on one of the main Spider Man titles. So, without any further ado, let's get into this. Number five, and it's a tie. It's John Romita Jr. and Mark Bagley. The Spider Man artists that I grew up with were John Romita Jr. and Mark Bagley. They are the quintessential Spider Man artists, two of the classics, modern day legends, not just Spider Man, but in the comic book industry in general, I simply couldn't pick one over the other, so I decided to bend the rules a little bit and just call it a tie between two masters of their craft. Both of these artists had significant runs on Amazing Spider Man, Peter Parker Spider Man, and of course, Bagley's marathon run on Ultimate Spider Man, which was 100 issues, a run that's almost unheard of in modern day comics. Both artists have very distinct styles, and yet there's one thing in common that I enjoy about both, and that's their storytelling. Their panel to panel flow is something every artist should study. I know sometimes I hear the same argument that John Romita Jr.'s art is too dark or too blocky for Spider Man, but I will defend his Spider Man till the end of times. Romita Jr. has always had an ability to create great mood and atmosphere with his art, and his attention to the little details I feel sometimes is a bit underrated. Now, Mark Bagley's art is, yes, classic and timeless. Even as early as when he took over Amazing Spider Man from Eric Larson, just in time for Spider Man's anniversary, his smooth storytelling and great facial expressions and body language made him a natural for Spider Man. And what impressed me the most about both of them is how they evolved as artists in the time that they've had their runs in Spider Man. Both artists have managed to evolve and update their art to keep up with the times and somehow became even better artists. And this is why I can't really pick one over the other. But hey, lists like these are just relative and different from person to person. In the end, they are two veteran artists that have cemented their legacies in the comic book industry, and I'm just happy to have witnessed most of their artistic evolution. Number four, Mike Wieringo. And Mike Wieringo came in a very pivotal time in Spider-Man comics. He came in after the whole Spider-Clone saga pretty much had ended. It was a time where a lot of people just stopped reading Spider-Man because the Spider-Clone saga, although it started with a lot of excitement and a lot of possibilities, it kind of got derailed somehow along the way, and sales were pretty much starting to go to an all-time low. And then they tried to reboot it with John Byrne taking over Peter Parker Spider-Man, and then leaving it as adjectiveless Spider-Man. And that didn't work out as well as they had hoped. John Byrne had pretty much successfully rebooted Superman in DC, and then he went on to do a very solid run on Wonder Woman before he jumped on to Spider Man. And from there, they kind of started to get better again. And one of those things that made it better was the launch of the Sensational Spider-Man. And that was the Spider-Man title that came out with writer Todd McFarlane and Mike Wieringo, which later on went on to create Telos for Image Comics, which is a fantastic title that they worked on with each other as well, that they worked together. And Sensational Spider-Man was just fun, and Spider-Man had stopped being fun for a very long time. It was kind of like the renaissance of Spider-Man. You know how there was the Disney Renaissance in the 80s after they had a few movies that didn't fulfill expectations, and then out came The Little Mermaid and Lion King and all these Disney movies that started to become bigger and bigger and bigger hits one after the other. So this was kind of like, to me, the Spider-Man renaissance in Marvel when Mike Ango was on it, John Romita was on Spider-Man, Steve Scroce was on Spider-Man as well. It was a great time, and Mike Ango brought a very particular energy to Spider-Man. His art has always been energetic and exciting, and it was just cartoony enough to have it be fun, but it was also such good on a technical side that you had to appreciate the artistry as well in his pencil work. So it was just the perfect kind of artist for Spider-Man, especially at that time, and especially with Todd McFarlane. They had such a great creative chemistry together, and that's when people started buying Spider-Man again. Pretty much like Joe Quesada said on the Spider-Man DVD of the 2000s Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire. He said that once they gave good Spider-Man back, people started buying it again. So yeah, the pretty much the fandom had forgiven Spider-Man after the whole Clone Saga debacle, and I do believe that Mike Wieringo was a big part of that when he was part of that. What I personally call the Spider-Man Renaissance in that brief moment of time. And Mike Wieringo was a class act. He was one of my all-time favorite artists. Unfortunately, as most of us know, he tragically passed away in the mid 2000s. So that was a real terrible loss. It was one of the few times that I actually personally cried over the death of somebody that I didn't know. It really touched a lot of people, and I'm glad to have seen his art. I'm glad that he was able to share his talents with the world, and he's number 4 on my list even now still. So that's how much his work created an impact on me personally. And what can I say? But his art was just fantastic, energetic, and fun. Number 3, Steve Scroce. Steve Scroce started to rise to fame on the alternate universe title X-Men, coming from the Age of Apocalypse storyline that altered the reality of the X-Men books. And X-Men was a younger Cable in this new reality, and the book was an instant hit. So much so that X-Men made the jump into the 616 universe. A huge part of that success was thanks in part to then up and coming artist Steve Scroce. After cutting his teeth on X-Men, he would make the jump to the revamped series of Amazing Spider-Man at a time where once again Marvel was trying to save the character after the Spider-Clone saga had driven away a lot of Spider-Man fans. Scroce was introduced at a time there was a big boom in the Spider-Man creative teams, which I mentioned before the number 4 spot when I was speaking about Mike Wieringo, as I personally call it, the Spider-Man Renaissance. And his art was just perfect for Spider-Man as well, for a very different reason than Mike Wieringo. His art is so stylized, and it seemed like an implosion of all my favorite artists and a flare of even anime and manga all into one. His attention to details in the background, his action scenes, It all screamed frenetic energy. And yet, he also knew how to do the more subtle, quiet moments. He's definitely a well rounded, full package artist. It's a shame that he doesn't. He took a long time to do comics again. After he had a big run on Spider-Man, he went on to do a short run on Gambit, and then he did a very short run on Wolverine as well before becoming a storyboard artist for a lot of movies like The Matrix, Speed Racer, V for Vendetta. So he had a pretty good career post comic, and he's been doing comics again lately. He had never really quite stopped. Every now and then he would do his creator owned Frankenstein comic that would come out every couple of years or something like that. But he came back to like more consistent work over the last few years when he did We Stand on Ground with writer Brian K. Vaughan on Image Comics, and then he did his creator own Maestros as well. So he's been doing a lot more comic book art in the past couple of years, which is to me excellent because he was one of my all-time favorite artists as well. Not just on Spider-Man, but in general, he's definitely one of the most influential artists in my style as well. Pretty much up there with Joe Quesada. So that's why he's pretty much number three on my personal list of Spider-Man artists. Number two, Humberto Ramos. I think it's safe to say that Humberto Ramos is now in the upper echelon of legendary Spider-Man artists. He's pretty much the modern day John Romita Sr. or Todd McFarlane of this generation, of this century, really. It's become the character he is perhaps most associated with now. And the fantastic thing is that this was, in fact, his childhood dream as he grew up in Mexico idolizing Spider Man. As most know, he had his USA debut in comics with Milestone Comics, with Milestone Media, DC Comics, and Hardware, and made his way to become the regular artist on Impulse, which was a spin off from Flash, along with writer Mark Waid. He would do on and off again things with Marvel like X Nation and a guest spot on the Uncanny X Men or a Gen 13 one shot for Jim Lee's Wildstorm. But it was his creator owned Crimson that brought him much attention as part of the joint venture that was Cliffhanger along with Joe Madureira and J. Scott Campbell. After Crimson wrapped up, he would develop another series named Out There for Cliffhanger as well, and the Revelations miniseries that he did through Dark Horse after Out There finished its run. And after he left Cliffhanger DC Comics and did Revelations with writer Paul Jenkins, that's when they started doing their collaboration on the sensational Spider-Man. Jenkins and Ramos had a spectacular run, including the return of the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus. He would eventually leave Spidey to do other works in Marvel like Wolverine, but soon enough he would go back to Spider-Man, and this time on the big one, the main Spider-Man title, Amazing Spider-Man, along with writer Dan Slott, in yet another attempt to save the character from what happened after One More Day, which left a lot of fans angry after the conclusion of that small event. And a lot has been said about the event. Spider-Man sales struggled again. It was pretty much the mid 90s all over again after the whole Spider-Clone saga. This time, that's what happened with Spider-Man in the 2000s after One More Day. It was very controversial. It was very divisive. It was very polarizing. And a lot of fans had stopped buying comics, Spider-Man comics altogether. And this is when they did another kind of like influx of talent again, like they did the Spider-Man Brain Trust when they would uh, rotate writers and artists on the Spider-Man titles to kind of give it a boost, and it worked. Like it eventually led to James Straczynski and John Romita Jr. working on Spider-Man. Of course, Dan Slott and Humberto Ramos doing their run on Spider-Man. So once again, Spider-Man was saved by the skin of his teeth once more, and Humberto Ramos definitely left his mark on the Spider-Man legacy. Ramos's art is expressive, energetic, fluid, and it has just the right amount of perfection for Spider-Man. When the brand new issue of Spider-Man came out a couple of years ago, the reboot of the Amazing Spider-Man #1 that came out, it was Humberto Ramos doing the art, which speaks volumes about how Marvel trusts in his talents, and that kind of cements his status as well as one of the biggest Spider-Man artists in the history of the franchise. And he still every now and again he still does like one issue or like a small issue run on Amazing Spider-Man, like when he did recently earlier this year during the Ryan Otley run as well. So he still sticks around with the Spider-Man franchise. It definitely became one of his most identifiable characters that people relate to his art. And again, he's one of my all-time favorite artists, and he is one of the all-time best artists on Spider-Man. And my #1 all-time favorite Spider-Man artist, Todd McFarlane. To those who are close to me, the top two is no surprise whatsoever. But contrary to the other artists on the list, I actually didn't read Spider-Man during the original David Michelini and McFarlane run of the 80s, nor the solo run that Tom McFarlane did in the early 90s. My introduction to Tom McFarlane was actually spawned through Wizard Magazine and through friends. I was familiar with his Spider-Man, but I was not buying the more teen stuff, if you will, at that time. I was still in elementary school when his run was on Amazing Spider-Man, and when I got into Spawn, I was in junior high school, and that's when I had already started buying the more, I guess, quote unquote, adult, more quote unquote cool comics, because during his Spider Man run, I was pretty much getting into the whole Archie comics and Looney Tune comics. Like, I still hadn't gotten out of that kind of phase. I was still just a kid back then. And it wasn't until back issues and reprints and trades that I was finally able to read his run. And after reading his run and watching interviews and seeing documentaries about Tom McFarlane, I appreciated all the artistic risks that he took on the title, how he dared to modernize the comic and give it a fresh, unique look that still stands to this day. Arguably one of the most influential comic book artists of all time. He took Spider-Man to a whole other level, to the point he still holds the record for the most sold single issue by a writer-artist with Spider-Man #1. His art was in your face, overwhelming with energy to the point where even the quiet, more mundane scenes seemed to leap right off the page. And yes, the poses seemed, well, really impossible for any human being to pull off. But at least let's concede this. Damn if it didn't look cool. It looked even cooler in some of the small nods to his poses in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films. Of course, he swore off doing any work for Marvel or DC ever again due to his responsibilities at Image Comics. But I'm still kind of hoping somehow, someday, maybe there will be a Spawn Spider-Man crossover. I mean, we got to see Spawn Batman with not only McFarlane drawing it. But Frank Miller, who at the time also had sworn off Marvel and DC, actually wrote that one-shot crossover. So, if anything, you can always expect unexpected. You never know. So I'm still kind of holding on hope for one day a Spider-Man Spawn crossover with McFarlane doing the art. And anyway, that's pretty much my list of top 5 all-time favorite Spider-Man artists. Well, if you want to get technical, 6. So there you go. With this, I hope you share your own favorite Spider-Man artist as well. I know there's a lot of great artists that did work on Spider-Man. Of course, there's the classic artists that were there from the beginning. So once again, if you have your own favorite artist, please do feel free to talk about it as well. These series of videos that I do about Let's Talk About is pretty much that, just to start a conversation, kind of like a comic book store, talking with your friends and other fans, or just strangers that sometimes end up talking about comics while we're like flipping through them or while we're at the counter. So once again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening. And I'll join you next time when I talk about my top 5 favorite Spider-Man writers.